that I sent out, Teresa.
Yeah, and you'll get that. Thank you.
It's in the email. Under, if you go chronologically, it's September 30th. That's where you'll find it.
It's a book reading.
Pardon?
It would be a book reading and study.
Well, it's poetry, though. It's a book of poetry. Dramatic reading of her poems, right? All right, pardon? So this afternoon we are very privileged to have Al Zolynas and Fred Moramarco. Al is from Escondido, far away from Escondido. Al was born in Austria of Lithuanian parents in 1945, same year I was born, and grew up in Sydney, Australia, and Chicago, Illinois. He holds a PhD in creative writing and English from the University of Utah and was a Fulbright Hays Fellow in India. He's worked as a kitchen helper, lifeguard, factory worker, cab driver, road construction worker, poetry editor, and resident poet in the schools, and currently teaches writing and literature at the USIU, the United States International University in San Diego. I think that may have changed. Okay, Al can tell you about it. He's also a longtime Zen student. He's the author of books including The New Physics, Under Ideal Conditions, which won the San Diego, was that the one that won the San Diego Book Award? Best Poetry. And editor of Men in Our Time, an anthology of male poetry in contemporary America with Fred Moramarco, and also the anthology, what's the name of the other
Poetry
one?
of Men's Lives.
Poetry of Men's Lives, so international poetry. His poems have been widely anthologized and translated into Lithuanian, Spanish, and Polish, the last by Czesław Milosz. Is that how you pronounce his first name?
Czesław.
Czesław Milosz, okay. All right, Al Zolynas.
Thank you, Dick. Thanks for the introduction and especially for inviting us to read here. I'll read a few poems from some of my books, and then I'll read a few poems that are after those books, a little more contemporaneous. So from The New Physics, Living with Others. Yesterday, I discovered my wife often climbs our stairs on all fours. In my lonely beastliness, I thought I was alone, the only four-legged climber, the forger of paths through thickets to Kilimanjaro's summit. In celebration then, side by side, we went up the stairs on all our fours, and after a few steps, our self-consciousness slid from us, and I growled low in the throat and bit with blunt teeth my mate's shoulder, and she laughed low in her throat and rubbed her haunches on mine. At the top of the stairs, we rose on our human feet, and it was fine and fitting somehow. It was Adam and Eve rising out of themselves before the fall, or after. It was survivors on a raft, mad-eyed with joy, rising to the hum of a distant rescue. I live for such moments. A man and his life. At night, a man asleep turns to his life. He tries to embrace it. As always, it skips just out of his reach and laughs at him. He chases it frantically, his feet heavy as unexploded bombs. Effortlessly, his life dances before him. He wants to grab it, to run it through some complicated steps, a tango, a foxtrot, a mazurka. He wants to love his life, but it will have nothing of that, and only giggles at him, rolling its hips at a safe distance. Many years ago, I was unemployed for a year, and given the times today, I thought this poem would be appropriate. It was strange to be as young as I was in my mid-30s and to not have a job and to be constantly going out looking for work and not finding anything in my field. Of course, I probably could have found some job outside my field, but I wanted to stay stay in my profession. So my wife and I were living in St. Paul, Minnesota at the time, and going down to the unemployment office periodically. And the rest of the time, hopefully, I was spending fruitfully writing poems. So this one's called Unemployment Compensation. On a Wednesday afternoon in late summer, the unemployed man wakes from a nap on the dining room floor, between the piano and dining room table. He is surrounded by wooden legs. He feels like the victim of a catastrophe, coming round now to the distantly concerned stares of strangers. Lie still, buddy. We've called for help. You'll make it. At such a moment, it is permitted for a man without a job and with no prospects to see his life clearly in the underside of a wooden table, unfinished and full of beautiful knots. No need. Thanks. Dick mentioned that I've been a long-time practitioner of Zen, and that's true. And if you know anything about Zen practice, you know it's about sort of just coming back to the moment over and over again and maintaining as much alert presence as you can in the vicissitudes and circumstances of our life as it arises, moment by moment. But even before I began practicing Zen, I was interested in whatever you would, however you would describe what Zen deals with. So I had written this poem years ago called The Zen of Housework. I look over my own shoulder, down my arms, to where they disappear underwater, into hands inside pink rubber gloves, moiling among dinner dishes. My hands lift a wine glass, holding it by the stem and under the bowl. It breaks the surface like a chalice rising from a medieval lake. Full of the gray wine of domesticity, the glass floats to the level of my eyes. Behind it, through the window, above the sink, the sun, among a ceremony of sparrows and bare branches, is setting in Western America. I can see thousands of droplets of steam, each a tiny spectrum, rising from my goblet of gray wine. They sway, changing directions constantly, like a school of playful fish, or like the sheer curtain on the window to another world. Ah, gray sacrament of the mundane. Some of my poems are sort of take off from random little scientific facts or bits of information that I pick up along the way. This one is one of those. It's called Under Ideal Conditions. And somewhere I read that if you light a candle and set it out on a vast plain and then just walk backwards, you can still see it after many more miles than you would think. Under ideal conditions. Say in the flattest part of North Dakota, on a starless, moonless night, no breath of wind, a man could light a candle, then walk away. Every now and then he could turn and see the candle burning. 17 miles later, provided conditions remained ideal, he could still see the flame. Somewhere between the 17th and 18th mile, he would lose the light. If he were walking backwards, he would know the exact moment when he lost the flame. He could step forward and find it again, back and forth, dark to light, light to dark. What's the place where the light disappears, where the light reappears? Don't tell me about photons and eyeballs, reflections and refractions. Don't tell me about 186,000 miles per second and the theory of relativity. All I know is that place where the light appears and disappears, that's the place where we live. Dick mentioned that I taught at U.S. International University. Not anymore. I've retired as of a year.
All right.
Happy to say. However, I had a very interesting and fruitful career as a university professor. And at the time, that school was noted, back in the day before this started happening generally, for attracting a lot of students from around the world. And I remember one particular time I was in a class with, it was only about 24, 25 students, but they had come from all over. And it was actually a freshman composition class, but it might as well have been an ESL class, because I had to kind of dig down deep and recover some of my own grammatical skills to work with these students. Anyway, the poem is called Love in the Classroom, dedicated for my students. Afternoon, across the garden in Green Hall, someone begins playing the old piano. A spontaneous piece, amateurish and alive, full of a simple, joyful melody. The music floats among us in the classroom. I stand in front of my students, telling them about sentence fragments. I ask them to find the 10 fragments in the 21-sentence paragraph on page 45. They've come from all parts of the world: Iran, Micronesia, Africa, Japan, China, even Los Angeles. And they're still eager to please me. It's less than halfway through the quarter. They bend over their books and begin. Hamid's lips move as he follows the tortuous labyrinth of English syntax. Yoshi sits erect, perfect in her pale makeup, legs crossed, quick pulse minutely jerking her right foot. Tony, from an island in the South Pacific, sprawls limp and relaxed in his desk. The melody floats around and through us in the room, broken here and there, fragmented, restarted. It feels Mid-Eastern, but it could be jazz or the blues. It could be anything from anywhere. I sit down on my desk to wait, and it hits me from nowhere. A sudden, sweet, almost painful love for my students. Never mind, I want to cry out. It doesn't matter about fragments, finding them or not. Everything's a fragment, and everything's not a fragment. Listen to the music, how fragmented, how whole, how we can't separate the music from the sun falling on its knees on all the greenness. From this moment, how this moment contains all the fragments of yesterday and everything we'll ever know of tomorrow. Instead, I keep a coward silence. The music stops abruptly. They finish their work, and we go through the right answers, which is to say, we separate the fragments from the whole. This poem falls under the category of poems about things that people don't normally write poems about. Cat puke and flies poem. I feed Marcello a can of liver and chicken. He bolts it down too fast as usual. 2 minutes later, he throws up on the back patio. The first fly shows up within seconds, ecstatic over life's bounty. Within minutes, the word's out somehow. Within minutes, the word's out. Somehow, the brothers and sisters coming in fast. The sun creeps along the cement floor. Pretty soon, half the cat puke is in light, the other in shadow, like sunrise on a volcanic island. At least 30 flies have gathered by now, walking around and eating what they're walking around on. I move in closer. Such organization and grace. No fuss, no fighting. There's obviously always enough for everyone in the fly world, and plenty of time to get off a quickie with your neighbor. I'm now on my hands and knees, my face within inches of the calm feeding of at least 50 flies. give or take arrivals and departures. None seemed to notice me, the sun glinting off their emerald thoraxes and through their purple wings. This is a poem that takes off from a little bit of scientific knowledge that I picked up along the way. There was a book written back in the 70s or even 60s called The Seven Mysteries of Life by a scientist by the name of Guy Murchie, who was pretty well known in his day, but he falls in the category of people who are hard-nosed scientists on the one hand, and then kind of have a fairly broad streak of mysticism in them also. But everything he talked about was in the service of accuracy and a kind of a view of the cosmos that was larger than what we sometimes ascribe to it. In other words, he was beyond, if you will, the universe being made up solely of dirt, frisky dirt, as somebody once said. Anyway, he said that he pointed out that the molecules, the number of molecules in a typical breath that you might take, like we're taking right now, would be equal perhaps to the number of breaths that were taken in a given day, which then in turn might have something to do with what happens to those breaths as they circulate around the world, and what happens to those molecules and atoms within the breath as it gets broken up and goes around the world. So anyway, it's called the same air. The same air that moves through me and you, through the waving branches of the bronchial tree, through veins, through the heart, the same air that fills balloons, that carries voices full of lies and truths and half-truths, that holds up the wings of butterflies, hummingbirds, eagles, hang gliders, 747s, the same air that sits like a dull relative on humid lakes in Minnesota in summer, the same air trapped in vintage champagne, in old bicycle tires, lost tennis balls, the air inside a vial in a sarcophagus, in a tomb, in a pyramid, buried beneath the sand. The same air inside your freezer, wrapping its cold arms around your TV dinners. The same air that supports you, that supports me. The same air that moves through us, that we move through. The same air frogs croak with, cattle bellow with, monks meditate with and on. The same air we moan with in pleasure or in pain. The breath I'm taking now will be in China in 2 weeks. My lungs have passed an atom of oxygen that passed through the lungs of Socrates or Plato or Lao Tzu or Buddha or Walt Disney or Ronald Reagan or a starving child in Somalia, or certainly you right here, right now. Yes, certainly you, the same air, the very same air. When I was in India, one of the things that astonished me, this is back in 1981, and I don't know if things are still the same. I suspect that they aren't, but that maybe some of this still applies. I was amazed at how much traffic there was, first of all, in the cities, places like New Delhi and Mahabalipuram, etc. But I was just amazed at how chaotic it seemed at first until you kind of got what the rules were. And the rules basically were that the bigger you were, the more right-of-way you had. So, trucks and semis and buses had more right-of-way than cars and taxis, let alone motorcycles or pedestrians. But I was on a group Fulbright, and we were at one point being transported by a bus, and the bus driver, who was out in traffic every single day of his life, had 3 gods up above his, where his visor was, to protect it. So the poem kind of took off from that. It's called Bus Service. Above the windshield, above the driver's seat, 3 bright deities face down the long aisle: Krishna, Jesus, and Ganesha. Their backs are to the mad onrush of traffic, their calm blessings on the driver and his passengers, who sit facing forward, as stiff as any parishioners in an English country church. Like the gods they are, the trio above move us through the chaos of city streets. To them, order incarnate. Guide to the driver priest's sweaty hands on the wheel and gear stick, and rule his pedal dancing feet through panic stops and violent swervings. They create the world for him to see through the smeared and stained glass before his face, and lead him down the one true path to our destination. Earlier, entering the bus temple, we noticed on the back of the driver's hand a tattooed Sanskrit Om, symbol of primal sound, pointing to the silence from which it arises, from which it all arises: the bus, the driver, ourselves, the dazzling, heartbreaking world. So here's here's a fairly recent poem. I started writing a little series of poems about being retired now and what life is like as a retired person. Anybody relate to that? It's different, isn't it? More work. Different way of living. But I was sitting in my little cafe one morning thinking about things, or looking at my computer or in my notebook, whatever, and I realized that I didn't have to dress up anymore. So this poem is called Dressing Down. The dark blue suit, the snappy corduroy jacket with its English prof leather elbow patches, hang now in the guest room closet, attracting silverfish. 2 pricey silk neckties, the remaining best of the lot, drape forlornly over a hanger. They're unlikely to fly in the breeze or strangle much anymore. My academic gown and its puffy medieval cap, worn once a year these last 44, have been dropped off at the local Goodwill. 2 pairs of dress shoes, one black, one cordovan, lie in their plastic boxes high on the columbarium of shelves in the dusty garage. In shorts, t-shirt, sandals, on an incomparable Southern California weekday morning, I raise a mug of coffee, a grateful toast to this new life, to what's in front of me, this almost empty parking lot, this scrap of paper. Just pardon me for looking at the clock, but I don't want to go over my half hour allotted time. This is another poem, a retirement poem, short and sweet, that starts off by remembering a childhood sequence and then brings it up to the present. It's called An Old Story. Across from the house where I grew up lived an old couple whose shadows slowly passed behind windows as we children played in the street, crying out in our joy and wonder. And here am I now, half of an old couple, behind winter windows, listening to children play in our cul-de-sac as a dark sky deepens and settles, and I swear I can hear my own voice calling out in the street. This poem is a little change of pace and has more to do with sort of celebrating, again, something that maybe wouldn't think of celebrating too often. It's celebration of the word of, O-V, of. Humble little word, pointing to others, obscure, in the shadows cast by important nouns, unobtrusive, shy servant in the impossible position of serving two masters, one always coming, one always going. Of thee I sing. Where would we be without you, little verbal gluer, relationship maker? Sprinkled throughout our texts, our speeches, our days, you bind the words together, the names, the references, the self-important pronouns, the ubiquitous I and me, mine, my. For love of me, for love of God and money, no rest for you, little humble servant. Of all the words, you are of the utmost importance. You and your ragamuffin cousins spread throughout our sentences, rarely together in one place. This poem shall bring you together. We will have a party of prepositions, conjunctions, connectives. Like true science in our own precious experience, you show us ultimately there's nothing but relationship. Our very nouns, carryovers from earlier, perhaps simpler times. You give the lie to our arrogant assurance, our belief that all the parts could be counted and named, divided and subdivided down to one nameable thing, a building block, a something on which to rest. So here in this poem you are. Let's throw a party, a relationship, a relational party, a language party, but without the self-important stink of pronouns, without the endless parade of nouns flexing their pumped-up torsos, without those flashy verbs, neurotic in their endless activity. Oh, and let's not invite those popinjay adjectives and adverbs, the hood ornaments of language. What a relief to be away from their glint and flashes in the noonday sun. No more those huge abstract nouns that roll in like dense fog or the invading tanks of a dreaded army, blanketing or crushing all in their path. Freedom, boredom, hope, glory. And those little specific nouns, seemingly modest, but also ultimately vain, with one eye always cocked at the mirror, proud of their gem-like specificity. Moat, follicle, rain, carcinoma, communique, opal, etc. Come, my little friends, choose up partners for the dance. Of with and, but with though, under with for, so with to, with when. Or gather in groups, gesturing silently, raising an eyebrow here, nodding there, a subtle wink, a shift of the body. On, under, by, yet, from, though, since, for, when, nor, because, as, if. Better still, dance the circle dance, join hands, fall together in an orgiastic heap. Show those nouns and pronouns what the world is truly. Sing together at last all that is relational, unseparate, that brings all together, the already but unseen togetherness, the ultimate unified field theory in action, right here in this poem, as everywhere, nowhere else. Not string, but the absence of string, the zero at the heart of any metaphor, the absence of everything, therefore the presence of all, which is the presence of no thing, the presence of presence. Ah. And I'll end with a little short poem tribute to my mother, who died a couple of years ago. Her name was Ona, O-N-A, and it's called Ona's Thumbs.
Give her a blessing.
Thank you for saying that. Take care.
What did you say? Give another.
Nothing like a mother's sacrifices there. Ona's thumbs. In her last years, my mother suffered from painfully cracked thumbs that no amount of doctoring or treatment could cure. We all tried to help her, researching salves and ointments, internal supplements, gloves and moist heat, even Louise Hay's metaphysics. Thumbs represent peace of mind. But to no avail. The condition persisted to her dying day. I know because we held her hand, my sister and I, that long Christmas Eve, its bird-like fragile warmth which gripped firmly early on, then only rested unmoving until it never moved again, and death had cured all her ills, major and minor. And now I find my own thumbs cracked and painful, unresponsive to treatment, but strangely welcoming this as a remembrance of my mother, who would ask towards the end, in her dementia of forgetting, only one thing, to please, please not forget her. Mother, how could I? Thank you.
I thought I'd try to bring us into the full present of the moment. I was struck by Al's poem about presence of life, the Zen notion of being present. And in order to get us present for all these poems, since we're on the kind of the second half of this reading, or at least second third of this reading, this is an open reading afterward, I want to start with this poem called The Present, which I wrote after reading in Harper's Index the estimated number of seconds that humans perceive the present to be 3. 3 seconds is the present. So I wrote a poem that has to be read in 3 seconds, so it's keep us in the present. So I have to read it really fast, all right? So listen carefully. It flits away from you just when you think you have it. As long as you're reading this poem, it's here. Finish it, it's gone forever. Stay in the present, read this poem again. So if you keep reading that poem, you'll forever be in the present. I want to actually do what almost is the opposite that Al did. I want to start with some new poems, and then I'll read some older poems, some poems from my collection. Actually, these are not so old. They're from a recent collection called The City of Eden. But these are poems that are unpublished yet. Well, actually, I just got notice today that this one is appearing in an online magazine. The poem is called Others. Always there are others, people you haven't met, you've all but forgotten, who've died or simply slipped beyond your mental reach. Stand across from them and look. On one side there's you, on the other, the others, and other things as well. In fact, everything that isn't you. Watch it as the crowd gets larger, stranger, as more time passes. You see more of it stretching across the landscape of your life, darkening in the early evening twilight. Yet there is no other you'd rather be, except younger, smarter, better looking, richer, more sophisticated, wittier, a more seasoned traveler, a better writer, more influential, happier, healthier. Nothing other than yourself leeching all the best of the others from them. Why not? What's a life for but to dream it? A greedy dream, you say? Yes, but mine, like yours, is not nearly as greedy as those of the others. This is a poem, we just passed Labor Day, so this is a poem called Labor Day, and it's a prose poem, really. So what is there to do on this day that we celebrate the contributions of working folk, except look at the world around us that working people made? the houses we live in, the roads we drive on, the streets we walk on, the lights we read by, the machines we operate, the faucets we drink our water from, the malls we shop at, the clothing we wear, the pictures we look at, the games we play, the movies we see, the mail we get, there's no end to it. There's not much we can't trace to working people except the clouds, the sun, the trees, the wind, the insects, the animals, the oceans, the night sky, and other things like that. The made world and the found world, two different places. One you only visit, the others where you'll spend eternity. This one is called Appearances. Objects in mirror are closer than they appear. The man sitting next to you is more frightened than he appears. The woman across the room is sexier than she appears. You are more self-involved than you appear. You are probably less confident than you appear. Small bears are more dangerous than they appear. The night is more frightening than it appears. The lecturer is not as smart as he appears. The homeless man is more desperate than he appears. Religion is not as comforting as it appears. Children are more resilient than they appear. Life is more complicated than it appears. Life is simpler than it appears. You and I are more alike than it appears. And so, appearances aside, is everyone else. This is called Poem on Demand. I like to write love poems. I mean, the reason you become a poet is to impress women. So I've written a lot of love poems across various days of my life. And this is called Poem on Demand. My lover said, "Sweetheart, write me a poem." And what could I do but simply comply? I sat at my desk in my office at home and searched for some words that would fly. But the words that came were a sorry lot. They whispered and crawled and shrugged. Sometimes they only worked up to a trot, but mostly they seemed like they were drugged. What's wrong, thought I, that my words come slow for my darling so far away? Perhaps I should draw on all I know, or forget about writing today. I know what I'll do, came the words in my head. I'll write her a poem that rhymes, a poem that will come from her old friend Fred, who's loved her through all sorts of times. And then she'll know that the words come slow, that they came to give her my heart. They'll say right out what I clearly know, that my love is real, not just art. And she'll laugh at this, she'll chuckle and smile, and that will be quite enough. The poem will have worked, at least for a while, so now I can do other stuff. This is a poem. I taught at San Diego State for 35 years. It's hard to believe, but I did. And when I first started teaching 35 years ago, one of the first courses I taught was a course in Milton. I wasn't by any means a specialist in Milton. I was the 20th century American poetry, American literature and poetry was my field. But the fellow who taught Milton was very seriously ill one semester, and they asked, I had just finished my PhD, and I had taken a course in Milton from a scholar named Jack Adamson at San Diego State, and I had voluminous notes on Milton. So I said, I'll take that course on Milton. So this is called Milton at Twilight. It's a play on a poem by Gary Snyder, you'll see in a minute. Long ago, when I began teaching, I taught Milton to undergraduates and remember being thrilled about the idea. Today, 40 years later, I opened my brittle copy of the complete poems of John Milton and was astonished by the detailed annotations. Every page of Paradise Lost, dense with marginalia, next to as one great furnace flamed, yet from those flames no light but darkness visible. I wrote, quote, opposite of God, darkness from light. A note referring to the magical line describing God in Book 3, dark with excessive brights thy skirts appear. Pages packed with much more of this about Christ, Satan, Adam, Eve, paradise and its loss, as well as references to critics, poets, scholars, including Blake's famous line about Milton being of the devil's party without knowing it because he wrote so well about Satan, and Hazlitt's notion that the way to defend Milton against all impugners is to take down the book and read it. And even a scrawl about Gary Snyder's poem, Milton by Firelight, where he asks, what use, Milton? A silly story of our lost general parents, eaters of fruit. What to ask now as I slide the volume back to its coffined shelf? Did I really study this so intensely and explicate it to students line by line? Or is that too a fiction, like all the vanishing past? One more of these old ones, the new ones rather, and then I'll go to the old ones and get the right one. This is called Things We Agree About. By we, I mean all of us, everybody. Time. Years, months, weeks, days, hours, minutes, seconds, whatever now is, distances, miles or kilometers, a yard, a foot, inches away, height and weight, pounds and ounces, speeds, cities, places on the globe. We all know Italy is shaped like a boot, England an island across from a dog-faced continent, Florida a long peninsula, Baja California the same. It's cold in Canada, hot in the Congo, though the weather's changing, that remains. Waves lapping against the shore, high and low tide, how each day we know the time it will arrive, the sun and the planets around it, the moon, the sublunar world we live in, how each life ends in a death and each morning is a miracle, the sustenance of sex, the wonder of birth, how change is the only constant, and the dream of tomorrow what we all share. Fire burns, ice chills, water flows, music wafts through the air. How alone we all are, and how together. What a familiar difference accompanies our days. Okay. I'm a little hesitant to read this one, but maybe I'll read this last new one. Lately, I've become a kind of crossword puzzle fanatic. This is what you do in your retirement. You do the crosswords. And especially you do the New York Times crossword, which is, as some of you probably many of you know, the Times crossword is very easy on Monday, and then it gets more difficult with each passing day until Saturday is a killer, you know. And then Sunday they've got this big puzzle that takes a long time, but is not really super. The really difficult one is on Saturday. So this is a poem that, if you see it on the page, there are lines crossing other lines in it. So part of it is to play on the idea of crosswords. But I'll just read it, and as I say, I'm not quite sure this poem is there yet, but I'll try it anyway. Crosswords. After I decided to take a role in a film called The Lonely Detective, my wife said she loved the way I filled the spaces of my life, like the New York Times crosswords I do each morning. Like life, they're much easier on Monday than they are at week's end, when you need to break your brain to figure out a clue like to call or call on, when the answer is simply see. And at first you can't figure out how see means to call. And then remember when you used to play poker that to see you means calling someone's bluff. On the Monday of our lives, things are pretty easy. Hours move along swimmingly. Everything comes along as you need it. Food, diapers, chains, tucked into bed, worries as rare as white tigers. Tuesday's not much worse, more playful. A few minor challenges like learning how to walk and talk. Then Wednesday gets a little tougher. There are books to read, things like state capitals and important dates to remember, as well as kids who bully you and food you don't like. Thursday is the time life gets really complicated. It's full of tricks. The puzzle might even be a rebus, which, as crossword buffs know, you can't figure out until you know what the secret word is. Then Friday, a real killer, complicated as physics, as hard to understand as endless wars. You sometimes toss the paper aside and say, "What's it all about, Alfie?" or some other such drivel. But if you hang in there, Saturday's absurdly difficult challenges waiting for you. Thriving in old age like George Burns or Betty White. Thriving like George Burns or Betty White, finishing it with a flair you never knew you even had. And then comes the long but welcome Sunday, the only puzzle with a stated theme and tons of empty space to fill. No one knows if it's an end or a beginning. Okay, I want to read a few poems from this book called City of Eden. I titled it City of Eden because I'm a city guy and I love cities. I was born in New York. And I have the quotation from Frank O'Hara, who's a poet. I think that probably influenced me more than any other poet. He wrote, "I can't even enjoy a blade of grass unless I know there's a subway handy or a record store or some other sign that people do not totally regret life." So that's the City of Eden. And here's the title poem, The City of Eden. You mean garden, don't you? No, city. Though there are apple trees there and snakes, lots of them. Those you can see and lots you can't. And those you can't. Adam names streets as well as animals and bridges that surge over rivers. Eve's there as well, sitting on a restaurant stool, eating ribs. And somewhere, a scowling Satan, angry as a wounded tiger, watching Adam and Eve, flirtatious and playful before the fall, hissing and moaning because he can't stand seeing two people so happy, here miles from their forest glen, in the City of Eden, the city of now and of then. And this is called a dress book. Last night, cleaning out the desk, I found an old address book, bent and battered, pages yellow, curled, the cover a mottled blue, stained with ink, wine, coffee, who knows what else. It had been there in the corner of a drawer for years now. I opened it with care, half imagining that small, exotic birds would fly out of it, chirp for a moment, and fall dead at my feet. I fixed on a name, Bianca Maria Tedeschini Lally, and suddenly Italy, 1972, seemed present in the room. Faces of students, scenes in streets, the decor of pensiones, the clock tower in Venice, my son Stephen, then 4, in awe of it. An Italian friend, Osvaldo Croce, piggybacking my son Nick across the Piazza San Marcos. The nostalgia so thick now, I can't see the present. I turned to the page to Lee Saita, my sister, an X through the name, dead how many years now? In Salt Lake. And Ben Santoli, my old sidekick, dealing cards in Vegas for decades, out of touch with him since the 70s. I can't flip through much more of this. Closing the book, I think about throwing it away, but put it back instead in the corner of a drawer where it came from. carefully like a rabbi returning the Torah to its sacred place, a scripture reminding me of who I am. This is called Clark Kent, Naked. This one's in one of the anthologies, isn't it? Poetry of Men's Lives, I think. Yeah. They found him in a phone, Clark Kent naked. They found him in a phone booth, huddled, frail as a fetus, shivering in the cold. The problem, he said, was that when he began to take off his clothes for the usual transformation, the blue and red suit with the yellow S emblazoned across the front just wasn't there. He couldn't believe it, he said, and kept disrobing when he was assaulted by a transient who took the pile of clothes. He insisted that no one tell Lois as they led him away, covered by a wool blanket, babbling incoherently to the air in front of him, remembering how things used to be. Poor Superman, can't be that anymore. And here's a poem dedicated to my colleague Al Zolynas called The Wonderful Unfathomable Dance. You know, Al's poems, as you heard, they all have a sort of a Zen quality. A lot of them have a Zen quality, and some of my poems do, but certainly not as many as Al's. But this one is sort of like trying to recognize the dance of the world, in a sense. The wonderful, unfathomable dance for Al Zolynas. It's only visible at the edge of things, a movement in the corner, the sudden shimmer of the sun at the end of its showy cartwheel sinking into the soft mystery of the sea, the motion of everybody and everything, surprisingly there for an instant, in an eye, gliding across the planet's rim. Your image in mine, mine in yours, on the freeways of California, on the streets of Bombay, the spectacular wholeness that links our days together in a single invisible surface. It's all there for our inspection, any time, any day, any place. I want to read a few sort of lighter poems to end with. This is a poem called At the Supermarket. It's sort of based on a true story. At the supermarket. My friend Dan, he has a crush on the cute blonde cashier at checkout counter number 3 at Vons. And he walks up and down the aisle from produce to dairy, casting back glances at her as she rings up grocery orders, one after another, like someone on the Ford assembly line tightening bolts. And she's into her work, smiling brightly at everyone who passes through, ringing up totals, giving out change, bagging meat and lettuce and everything from Glad Wrap to Mondavi Cabernet, waiting for the night to pass because she's got her own fantasies. Dan's checking her out each time he turns up another aisle, moving methodically from breakfast cereals to household cleaning supplies, passing Pampers, gliding past Tide, gathering pasta sauce and nacho chips. He's working up the courage to say something to her on the way out, something that will be honest, from the heart, that will get her attention, that will show her right away he's not like all the other guys who would only be interested in her gorgeous smile, the glimmer of her skin, the way her breasts press firmly against the contours of her blouse, a few gold tresses hang loosely on the pinkish pallor of her cheek. And so he rolls his cart down the aisle to the end of her line while he frets feverishly about what he might say to her. And after rehearsing one sentence and then another as the line grows shorter, he's finally face to face with the remarkable green of her eyes. And he says, "You know, you're absolutely beautiful. What can I say to you to get you to go out with me?" And she looks at the groceries and says, "Paper or plastic?" That's about the power of beautiful women. let me finish with a couple of poems here about
That was a good one.
about two poems that are very present. One is called "The New Technology," and it takes off from a line by Alexander Pope, in the great 18th century English poet who wrote in couplets. So the poem is in couplets, kind of imitating Pope. And the line it's taken off from Pope, because Pope was living in a time somewhat like ours in the sense that there was a new philosophy coming in, the new philosophy of science, the empirical way of looking at the world, as opposed to the biblical way or the analogical universe of days past. And in those times there were four elements: earth, air, water, and fire. And suddenly science comes along and says, wait, that's all wrong. That's not the way to look at the world. There's lots of different elements out there, and there are a new way of looking at things. So Pope wrote this wonderful line that's often quoted: "The new philosophy throws all in doubt. The element of fire is quite put out." And so I wrote about the new technology, a similar kind of thing. I know that I'll sound like a very old fart when I speak of technology as if it were art. But what's there to say about IMs and Skype, except I like magic despite all the hype? I sit in my room in London, UK, and talk to my sons who are quite far away. I not only talk, but I see them as well. Now tell me that's not magic as hell. For 10,000 miles without any wires, the images travel in visible flyers. The sounds move as well, and like everything new, how all of this works, I haven't a clue. If you can explain in clear English, please, friend, how when I slip a card in an ATM, it checks my account across oceans and land and hands me some cash like mere grains of sand. Or think of the cell phone, ubiquitous now. You know what it does, but please tell me how. I doubt that you can. It's way beyond most who can hardly explain a fresh slice of toast. Or the way the blood pulses around in our veins and our jaws become clenched when told by our brains. This is human, we know, though we can't quite explain why life is so filled with pleasure and pain. But some say technology is overrated, and to ooh and to ah is quite outdated. So I won't go on about digital pics, because I think these things aren't really good tricks. Life and machines have a long course of history. Together, apart, they're always a mystery. Live in doubt and accept it. That's just how it is. And waiter, I'll have another gin fizz. and finally, this is a poem I think some of you will recognize, those of you who watch the evening news. It's called "Talking to My Doctor." I need to ask my doctor about Lipitor, whether it's right for me, whether I need it. And I have to ask him if Cialis or Viagra is best to do the job I need them to do. I should talk with my doctor about why Zoloft might make me happier, or if I need something better like lithium. That is, whether my disorder is situational or chronic, just plain depression, or if it's bipolar, moving from manic actions like writing this poem to moments of absolute despair when nothing matters, not even food. I must talk to my doctor tomorrow and ask him if over-the-counter Claritin is just as good as prescription Claritin was, or whether I need to take 2 over-the-counter pills for every single prescription pill I've taken. I ought to talk to my doctor about whether I should continue to take low-dose aspirin each night, or if I need to back off that regimen but keep up the Zantac at 300 milligrams twice daily, or try to lighten up with the extra strength over-the-counter size at 150 in the bright new gold package. I'll ask my doctor if we're beyond wine and booze now, beyond even beer, if we now require the serious stuff only doctors can prescribe. Will Allegra clear up my allergies best, or do I need Flonase? I know Nexium will heal the damage, but what about Prilosec? And if I'm forgetting things lately, so I'll query him about Aricept ask him if he can really slow down the onset of Alzheimer's. I think I'm forgetting who it is I am, where I've been, and what I believe. I'll ask my doctor. He'll tell me, won't he? Thank you very much, sir.
Let's take a 5-minute break so y'all can talk to them about their books. There's a book table over here, and hopefully you'll buy some books, and then we'll have an open mic after 5, maybe 6 minutes, all right? And their bathrooms are right outside this door.
Thank you so much. Oh, great. I was staring at you because that's what I knew you were going to do.
Oh, did I turn this off? No, I don't think I did.
Oh.